Turn with me in your Bibles, please, to Daniel chapter 1. We'll be looking at that a little bit this evening. I am super excited that I get to preach to you guys. I texted Pastor and was like, hey, any chance I could preach sometime? I threw out a bunch of dates, and he graciously allowed me this evening, so just bear with me as we dive into the Word together. This past year, I've been a dorm counselor at Bob Jones University, finished up my first year of my master's. I'm getting an MA in ministry studies, hoping to someday get into a church somewhere, maybe youth pastor, associate pastor, something like that. We'll see how God leads. However the Lord wills is ultimately where I would like to end up. But right now, we will be diving into Daniel chapter 1. So let's dive in. As you see, this is probably a passage you are pretty familiar with. That this is one you've probably heard said over and over in Sunday school growing up. You're pretty familiar with it. But let's look at it this evening and just think about it. You were ripped from your homeland. You have no idea what's going to go on. You're treated oddly well, but given like these new names. But look at how Daniel and his three friends respond in this passage. So starting in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked that the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And in verse 9 it says, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord, the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king? Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. Verse 14 says, so we listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were in better appearance, fatter in flesh, than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. As for these youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all, the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. Going to the public school is a whole lot different than spending time at Bob Jones. Yes, you can imagine that there's a whole lot of different rules at Bob Jones, but being in a public school was such a cool ministry opportunity that I had growing up. And I went from like kindergarten through 12th grade, and I really did enjoy it. I mean, I made some good friends. I had some good Christian friends, but then also like after I graduated, we seemed to have a little bit of problems there with the public school. You see, there's this one English teacher in the high school who was just trying to put some books in the hands of students that nobody would want to, that some parents wouldn't want their kids reading in the first place. So you're wondering, all right, what are you going to do with this? Well, these parents are like, man, the community is kind of shook. I mean, the community we live in is largely conservative, and they don't want to see these books in the hands of our kids, so like, what are they going to do with this? And at that point, parents had two options. They were either going to sit back and let the school just run with it. The school seemed to be reinforcing it, just letting the teacher do what she wanted. While these parents, they wanted to take a stand, make sure that what was actually being taught to their kids was something that they wanted, that they had control over, that they could actually use in their lives. And much like that, we often choose the first. We want to sit back. We don't want to create waves in the sea. When we create waves in the sea, people tend to not like us. They're like, oh, let's just settle down here. They're getting too up and out of hand with this. But that's often what we choose, isn't it? We just want to go along with the flow. And how often is it that we just seem those flat waters just so desirable? We conform to society's demands out of a desire to keep peace. We don't know if we should stand up for God's work. Like maybe it's just a me thing. Like maybe I don't really need to stand up here. Maybe it's not that big of a deal in the first place. In Daniel 1, Daniel reminds us to be faithful to God. It wasn't anything of Daniel. It wasn't anything he was, but it was who his God was, and that he was sovereignly ruling. God sovereignly gives, and therefore you must be faithful to him. And we see that starting in verses 1 through 7. We see that you must be faithful because he sovereignly gives authority. Starting in verse 1, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim the king of Judah into his hand, and some of the vessels of the house of God. So we see here is that this king who was in control, he was over here, he's just living this, he was in his 3rd year, he was having all this control, ruling over this kingdom, but he's given over. And it says that God gave him over. God was the one who had put him into authority to begin with, and he is the one who gave him over to this king, Nebuchadnezzar. God removes kings from their place of rule and authority. And our surrender depends on God because he rules over this current authority. As we said, he's the one who put this authority into place. So if God even ordains the ungodly rulers here, like we see with Nebuchadnezzar, this God allowed him to be given authority, that he gave Jehoiakim over to Nebuchadnezzar in the first place, we must submit to that even though he is ungodly. It says in verse 3, then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and the nobilities, youths without blemish, of good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, competent. These were like some stand-up people. They were like the best of the best. People understood that, okay, I want to be like those guys. And they decided to take them from their homeland and take them all the way back to Babylon, pretty much. And they're like, okay, these are going to be people who we can teach, train, we can make them more like us. And so, obviously, they went along. They just obeyed. They submitted. And God ordains your submission to a king's authority. Because God allows kings to give ordinances in his authority to begin with. So he allows Nebuchadnezzar to bring these Israelites over. And is like, hey, we're going to bring them up. We're going to teach them all these good things. These things that would obviously probably advance the Israelites in their learning or in some way, shape, or form. And God allows them to rule how they wish. If you look down in verse 6 and 7, they're stripped of something that's probably the most important to somebody in how they live. It says, among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah of the tribe of Judah, and the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. So he takes their names. If you know, like, a name is something you hold tight to. Like, if people call me something other than Micah, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but, like, that's something we hold, and we hold to a prideful stance. I remember growing up that my brother Matthew, he was, like, we call him Matthew. There's no Matt, there's no It's Matthew. Like, he corrected me anytime I called him Matt on accident, even if it was on accident. Like, he corrected me because that's something he holds tight to. But these people, they were stripped of their name, and they did so willingly that they just went along, and they went along with submission. Could you imagine having to be called a different name? These were authorities that God had put into these 4 young men's lives. I imagine it's much like being put into the military. You know, I always cracked up that you see these kids who are, I guess I am a kid still, so I can't say these kids. You see these young people who are just like, they're so rebellious, and they're like, man, I cannot wait to get out of my parents' house. And they're dying, they're chomping at the bit. They're like, man, I cannot wait to leave these overbearing rulers that I have as parents. And they're just dying to get out. And you're like, okay, well, what do you want to do once you get out of the house? They're like, I want to go into the military. And it always makes you laugh because you're like, what? Like, you're leaving one overbearing ruler to one that everybody would define as a very overbearing ruler, and that is the military. They tell you to jump, you jump. They tell you anything, it's sir, yes, sir, and you get right to it. Like, you're jumping right to it. And that's the way that we are to respond to authority in our lives. That we jump right to it, go right away. There's an authority that God has given, and it extends much more than that. I imagine we face many different situations, but God gives earthly authorities, and it could be anything from a parent to a boss at work. Maybe your boss at work, he asks you to do this presentation, or just work on it and present it. And you're like, yo, that may be a little much for me. Like, I'm not really good at getting up in front of people, and I can't really speak like that. Like, I'm going to stutter, I'm going to stammer around. Can I actually do this? And you're like, you know what, boss man, you give it to someone else. I'm not good at this. He's like, no, come on, you can do this. I really think you're very knowledgeable about this. Like, you can be the one who does this. And you guys go back and forth. And you have a choice there of, am I going to do this and submit to his authority, or am I going to rebel? As we see here is that God has given these authorities in our life for a reason, and we are called to submit. And it extends much more than just the workplace. It extends to home. We have some young people here, like myself, who we have to submit to our parents. We aren't out of their house yet, so we still have to submit to them and obey what they say. They tell us to jump, we jump. And the same way could be said with the government, that there's a speed limit posted, and we should probably obey the speed limit to some extent. I know I'm very guilty of that myself, not abiding by the speed limit, but they post something up there. We should probably abide by it. Go through with it. They are a God-given authority. You must remain faithful to God, and practically, that is submitting to earthly, God-given authorities. But when faced with the reality of authorities, remain faithful to God by submitting to your authorities. Second of all, I'd like us to look at verses 8 through 16. Here it says, God gives favor. There's 3 gives that are pointed out here, and I went through the first one, but we're going to get to the second 2. It says, you must be faithful to the Lord because he sovereignly gives favor. Let's look at verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. The Lord gives favor in circumstances when you are under authority. Daniel was first faithful to God. Therefore, he was given favor to those in earthly authority over him. The chief eunuch even heard him with his little rebuttal about, hey, I don't know if I should eat this food. Now, we don't know exactly why he was like, all right, I can't eat this food. We may think, okay, the law gives specific dietary recommendations of what is clean and unclean, but there was several meat in there that they could have eaten and still would have been fine and would have been clean by all lawful standards. This meat could have been offered to idols. So we don't know exactly why he he says it's unclean, or why he doesn't want to defile himself with it. But we do know that his faithfulness is to God first. And so therefore, he was given favor to those in authority. We see that in verse 9 where it says, God gave Daniel favor. So our faithfulness to God depends on our heavenly king, not our earthly authorities. Because these earthly authorities, they're like, okay, you should eat this. But he's like, you know what? I don't know if this is exactly the thing that I need to be eating right now. So he gives this little rebuttal against it, and he did so respectfully. He wasn't just like, dude, I'm not eating that, smacks it up against the wall and walks out. But he's like, hey, is there perchance we could have something else to eat? It continues in verse 11. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and then deal with your servants according to what you see. So the Lord allows us to serve him even under authorities who are against him. These authorities were against God, and Daniel was still allowed to serve God. Like, they were still given vegetables and water. That's not much of a diet. I'm not sure I really want to be eating that right now, but like, they were given vegetables and water, and that was what God had set before them as what they should be eating. They were remaining faithful to God first. And give this little rebuttal. And as God gives favor before authorities, so we can serve him boldly. And God gives favor in appearance towards those in authority. If you look down at verses 14, 15, and 16, it says that they look good. They tested them after 10 days. And they were better in appearance. They were fat. They were looking better. They're like, oh, wow, those guys are looking way better than everybody else who's here. They're like, that's more desirable. As God gave favor, he allowed them to serve him boldly, and they were even given even more favor. They were more desirable. Let's jump back to our military illustration. If you're constantly obeying your superiors, they tell you to do something, you're sir, yes, sir, jump right to it, and you even go above and beyond, you start to earn favor with them. I'm sure at some point Daniel and his three buddies, they had choices where they had to choose to submit to this authority. And if they chose to submit, I'm sure they were faithful to God first, so they were going above and beyond. And they were earning favor, no doubt. Because as we earn favor, you're earning favor with that drill sergeant. They're noticing that. Pretty soon you're going to be like a lieutenant or something. I don't know how that whole ranking works. But you're going to work up the ranks quick. You're going to keep going as you're earning favor. Let's go back to your boss. He asks you to do this presentation. You go through it, and afterwards you get done. And he's like, man, I'm so happy you did that. Like, I know you weren't the most comfortable about doing that, but that was actually really good. And so then you start to earn this favor. So later on, he comes to you and he's like, hey, what do you say we start like skimming this money off the top? Like, the company can do without a little bit. And you're like, oh, man, that doesn't sit right with me. I don't know if that's actually the best thing I can do. Like, dude, that's not going to be right before my God. Like, I know you and you're my boss, and I really should be listening to what you say, but, dude, I serve my God first, and that doesn't sit right with him. And you've earned this favor so you can actually stand up and boldly serve your God rather than picking the little fights earlier of like, dude, no, don't call me Belteshazzar. I'm going to be called Daniel from here on out. As he actually submitted, and he earned favor before God, as we would earn favor before our earthly authorities, because God is the one who brings that favor. God gave Daniel favor in the first place. When a child obeys his parents then trust him more. As we obey our authorities, we are given favor by God, and we are seemed desirable before our earthly authorities. So we must remain faithful to God. In choosing to be faithful to God, we submit to authority, and we can stand firm because we have gained favor. If being faithful to God, you find favor to boldly stay faithful to God, and God gives that to you. So we've looked at God gives authority. God gives, do you guys know what the second one was? Sorry, I just want to make sure you guys are paying attention. So God gives authority. God also gives favor. And then God gives ability as well. We see that in verses 17 through 21. You must be faithful to the Lord because he sovereignly gives ability. In verse 17 it says, as for these youth, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. God enables despite the surrounding circumstances. They probably weren't in the best circumstances. They were removed from their home. They were having to battle against this authority that they were like, dude, I don't know if I should be eating that, but also like I'm being called this new name. How does this exactly work out? I'm trying to balance all this stuff. But God gave them enablement. And he not only he gives the ability in everything we do. He gave them the ability to learn skill in all literature, wisdom. Daniel could even understand and interpret all visions and dreams. He's able to tell them, hey, dude, your dream means this. Because God gives the ability to understand beyond what we can do in our own strength. That we could look at something and be like, dude, I don't know if I could do that, but God gives the ability. It's nothing that we are. God gives it to us. And God's enabling is distinguished. In verses 18 through 21, we see that they stood out above the rest. In verse 20, it says they were 10 times better than all these others. All the magicians, they were 10 times better. The enchanters didn't even stand a chance. They were 10 times better. They were more desired because God gave them the ability to do it. God enables and gives boldness before earthly authority. And God's enabling stands out above all the rest. He is the one who gives. At Christmas break, I was heading back to Bob Jones, and I was heading on my way. My brother and I hop on the road, and we start driving away. And we're getting going. We're about an hour away. We're like on 31 south of Rochester, and we're driving. You know, we're just trucking away. And I'm looking down at my miles per hour, and I'm like, dude, we're about 70, 75, all right. That's about 10 over the speed limit. I'm like, okay, yeah, you know, I'm doing good. I'm making good time here. This is awesome. Yeah, I love it. And I'm like, you know what? It's been a while since I've gotten pulled over. This is good. I really like this. I'm getting away with it. You know what? You know why I'm not getting pulled over? Because I'm too good. I'm too good compared to those other guys. You know what? All these other guys are going to get pulled over. I can see those cops before they see me. That's why I'm doing so well. And so then I think I even turned up my music a little bit. I was listening to my Sunday morning music, and I'm on my way, and I'm getting ready to go. And I kid you not, like 5-10 minutes later, I see red and blue lights over in my rearview mirrors. And I'm like, well, Micah, that was stupid. I had a choice to be thankful to God for the ability to drive, to be humble enough to be like, God, you're the one who gave me the ability to drive in the first place. But instead I was like, you know what, this is me. Yeah, you know what, I can drive. I can do all this, yeah. Look at me, I can swerve in and out of cars. Yeah, I'm doing great. Don't do that. That's dumb, not smart, stupid, all that stuff. But I'm just driving. And I could have thanked God for the ability to drive. But instead, I was so conceited, selfish, and prideful to think, you know what, this is of me. And the same goes with any area of life. It could be at work that we think, oh, dude, I'm so much better than this other guy. You know what? I can input that data in Excel so fast, nobody else stands a chance. I can run wire so fast, it's so much better than anybody else. And it could be 10 times better than anybody else. It's like Daniel and everybody else here. But it's not me. It's not you. It's not anybody that's in here that gives us that ability. It is God. God gives the ability. God allows us to serve him to the best of our ability, and he enables. So we may be at home and we're like washing these dishes like, man, nobody washes these dishes like I do. It is so good. But no, that's all that comes from God. God gives us the ability to drive, to wash dishes, to type on a computer, it doesn't matter what it is, God gave us that ability. Just as he gave Daniel the ability to interpret dreams, the ability to learn, the ability to understand, that all came from God. And God requires that we remain faithful to him. Why? Because he gives. He is a God who gives authority. He is a God who gives favor, and he is a God who gives ability. You know, in this school, there are multiple Christian families. And it was so cool to see as these parents decided to stand up and take a stand against what was wanting to be taught in this school. They're like, nope, you know what? God would not want my kids to be taught that in school. God would rather I be able to teach that from a biblical standpoint. That I can show them, hey, this is what God's word says about that. Because they wanted to honor God even in how their kids were being taught. So when our natural inclination may be to just roll over, just give, and you know what, all right, you know what, they can have that. It may not be as good for us. We should take a stand, be faithful to God. But sometimes that looks like submitting. Sometimes that's like, hey, you know what, I'll do what you say. I'll do that presentation. You know what, I'll do what you say. I'll follow that speed limit. You know what, I'll do what you say. I'll wear that mask right now. Who knows how long I'll have to wear that for? You know what, I'll do what you say. It's not that bad. You know what, I'll do what you say. I'll shave my beard while I'm at Bob Jones. It's not that bad. You know what, I'll do what you say because God has called me to be faithful to him. And sometimes that looks like taking a stand, saying, hey, yo, you can't teach my kids that. Like, this is what God's word says. Hey, you can't tell me to skim money off the top. That's God's word says I shouldn't steal. Say, hey, I'm going to take a stand and be faithful to my God. So remain faithful to God because he is a God who gives.